Sometimes the hardest battle a man faces isn't against his enemies, but against the quiet voice that whispers he's past his prime. Every morning, Bjorn the Giant looked in the still water of his well and saw a stranger, a farmer, where once stood the most feared Viking warrior in all the northern lands. For 20 years, he had lived this simple life, tending his sheep and growing barley on his small farm. His legendary battle axe hung silent on the wall, gathering dust while his hands grew soft from milking cows instead of gripping weapons. Then one morning, the earth beneath his farm cracked open like an egg, revealing a cave filled with ancient runes and shadows that moved on their own. What Bjorn found in those depths would force him to face a choice: remain the peaceful farmer he'd become, or embrace the warrior destiny that had been waiting beneath his feet all along. But what ancient secret had been sleeping under his land for centuries? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the rolling hills of Bjorn's farm like the ghosts of old battles, refusing to lift until the sun climbed high enough to burn them away. He stood at his wooden fence, watching his small flock of sheep graze in the pasture, their bells creating a gentle music that had replaced the clash of steel in his daily symphony. His massive hands, once calloused from gripping sword hilts and shield rims, now bore the softer marks of farm work, rope burns from hauling water, small cuts from mending tools, the honest dirt of a man who worked the earth instead of spilling blood upon it. 23 years had passed since Bjorn the Giant had last raised his battle axe in anger. 23 years since he'd earned his name by cutting through enemy shields like they were made of parchment. The villagers in Thorvald, 3 miles down the valley, knew him only as the quiet farmer who brought the finest wool to market and never spoke of the old days. They saw his enormous frame still broad as a barn door, despite his 52 winters, and perhaps wondered about the scars that crisscrossed his forearms, but they were kind enough never to ask. The battle axe hung on the wall of his modest stone house, its iron head still sharp despite years of neglect. Sometimes, when the wind howled through the mountains and reminded him of the songs they used to sing before battle, Bjorn would catch himself staring at the weapon. The leather grip was worn smooth, where his hands had held it through countless raids across the northern seas. The blade itself bore nicks and scratches, each one a memory of a life he'd chosen to leave behind. On his ring finger, he still wore the simple silver band that Ingrid had placed there 30 years ago. She had been the daughter of a Celtic chieftain he'd met during what was supposed to be a raid on her father's coastal village. Instead of pillaging, he'd found himself negotiating and falling in love with a woman whose green eyes held more fire than any battlefield he'd ever seen. Their marriage had been the first step away from the violent life he'd known. Her death in childbirth, along with their son, had been the final push toward this isolated existence. The ring caught the morning light as he reached for the bucket to milk his cows. Bessie, the old brown cow who'd been with him longer than any companion save his memories, lowed softly as he approached. These simple creatures depended on him now, and there was a peace in that dependence that warfare had never provided. No politics, no betrayals, no young men dying for the pride of kings they'd never met. "Good morning, old girl," he murmured to Bessie, settling onto the 3-legged stool beside her. The rhythm of milking was meditative, a steady pulse that matched his heartbeat. Across the pasture, his neighbor, Eric's son, was driving cattle to the high meadows. The boy, Gunnar, barely 16, often stopped to chat and ask questions about farming. He reminded Bjorn of himself at that age, though thankfully Gunnar showed no interest in raids or battles. The village of Thorvald existed in a pocket of peace that Bjorn had helped create through his very absence from the wider world. Here, disputes were settled with words rather than steel. The greatest drama involved whose turn it was to use the communal mill, or whether old Henrik's fence was encroaching on his neighbor's land. These were problems Bjorn could help solve with patient mediation rather than violence. Yet sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, he felt a restlessness that farm work couldn't cure. It wasn't nostalgia for battle. He'd seen enough blood to last several lifetimes. It was something else, a sense that he was waiting for something without knowing what. The feeling had grown stronger recently, accompanied by strange dreams of underground chambers and voices calling his name in languages he didn't recognize. The ground beneath his feet had been trembling slightly for weeks now, barely perceptible vibrations that might have been distant thunder or settling earth. His animals had noticed it too. The sheep clustered closer together than usual, and Bessie had been skittish during milking. Even the chickens seemed nervous, pecking at the ground with unusual urgency. Last Tuesday, Astrid, the village wise woman, had stopped by with honey from her beehives. She'd stood in his doorway longer than necessary, her weathered face creased with concern. "The bees are agitated," she'd said without preamble. Astrid never wasted words on pleasantries. "They sense something stirring in the deep places. You should be careful, Bjorn Eriksson." He'd thanked her for the honey and the warning, though he hadn't understood what she meant. Astrid had a reputation for knowing things others didn't, a gift passed down through generations of women who served as healers and counselors. Her grandmother had been present at his birth, and her great-grandmother had supposedly prophesied the coming of a warrior who would one day choose peace over power. The trembling had grown stronger yesterday evening as he'd secured his animals for the night. Standing in his doorway, looking out over the farm he'd built with his own hands, Bjorn had felt something vast moving far beneath the earth. Not an earthquake, he'd experienced those before. This was different, purposeful, as if something long sleeping was beginning to stir. He finished milking Bessie and carried the bucket toward the house, pausing at the well where he drew water each morning. The well had been here when he'd claimed this land, its stones ancient and moss-covered. According to village stories, it had been dug by the first settlers centuries ago, though some of the older folks whispered that it was far older than that. Peering into the dark water, Bjorn saw his reflection wavering in the depths. The face that stared back bore little resemblance to the young warrior who'd once struck terror into enemies' hearts. Grey streaked his beard now, and lines mapped the years around his blue eyes. His hair, once golden as summer wheat, had darkened to the color of winter storms. But his hands remained steady, and his shoulders, though they carried 20 years of peace, were still strong enough to swing an axe if needed. The thought troubled him. Why would he need to swing an axe? Those days were behind him, buried as deep as the friends he'd lost in distant battles. He had everything a man could want: land, purpose, respect in the community, and the rare gift of having survived a warrior's life with his soul intact. Yet as he stood there, bucket in hand, watching his reflection in the ancient well, Bjorn couldn't shake the feeling that his peaceful retirement was about to end. The trembling beneath his feet seemed to pulse with a rhythm that matched his heartbeat, and somewhere in the distance he could swear he heard the faint sound of something massive stirring in the deep places beneath the world. The silver ring on his finger caught the light again, and he found himself thinking of Ingrid's last words. "Promise me you'll know when it's time to fight again, and when it's time to lay down your sword forever." He'd thought he'd already made that choice. Now, standing at the well with the earth trembling beneath his feet, he wondered if the choice had been made for him long ago by forces he'd never dreamed existed. The bucket felt suddenly heavy in his hands, though he knew it contained nothing but fresh milk. Something was coming. He could feel it in his bones, in the nervous energy of his animals, in the way the very air seemed to hold its breath. Whatever it was, it would test everything he'd built here, everything he'd chosen to become. Bjorn the Giant, farmer and former warrior, stood at his well and watched his reflection ripple with the vibrations coming from deep below. Soon, very soon, he would discover that some destinies can only be delayed, never truly escaped. The earth split open with a sound like the world breaking. Bjorn had been checking his fence posts when the ground beneath his feet suddenly heaved upward, throwing him to his knees. The trembling he'd felt for weeks erupted into a violent shaking that sent his sheep bleating in terror toward the far pasture. Clods of dark earth flew through the air as a jagged crack appeared in the center of his barley field, widening with each thunderous rumble until it gaped like a hungry mouth. Steam rose from the fissure, carrying with it a scent that made his warrior instincts flare to life, the metallic tang of old blood mixed with something else, something ancient and wrong. The crack was easily 20 feet across at its widest point, and when Bjorn crawled to the edge on his hands and knees, he could see no bottom to the dell. Darkness below. By Thor's hammer, he whispered, the old oath slipping from his lips unbidden. He hadn't spoken those words in over a decade. His livestock had fled to the furthest corners of his property, huddling together with the wild-eyed terror of creatures that sensed predators nearby. Even Bessie, normally the calmest of his animals, stood pressed against the barn wall, her sides heaving with panicked breaths. The very air seemed to thrum with an energy that made the hair on his arms stand on end. Bjorn forced himself to stand, his legs unsteady not from the earthquake, but from something deeper, a recognition in his bones that this moment had been inevitable. The peaceful life he'd built was cracking apart just as surely as his barley field, and there would be no mending either. He fetched a rope and torch from his barn, hands moving with the decisive efficiency of a man long accustomed to facing the unknown. The torch flames danced wildly in the strange air currents rising from the chasm, casting shifting shadows that seemed to move independently of their source. As he secured the rope around a sturdy oak tree at the field's edge, Bjorn caught glimpses of something glowing far below a blue-green light that pulsed like a slow heartbeat. The descent was treacherous. The earthen walls of the fissure were loose and crumbling, threatening to give way under his considerable weight. Twice he had to stop and brace himself as stones broke free and tumbled into the depths, their echoes taking far too long to fade. The blue glow grew stronger as he descended, and with it came sounds that no natural cave should make, whispers in languages that predated the Norse tongue, and beneath that, a rhythmic breathing that seemed to emanate from the stone itself. 40 feet down, his boots touched solid rock. The fissure had opened into a vast natural chamber carved from living stone, its walls covered in symbols that hurt to look at directly. The blue light came from runes etched deep into the rock face, each character pulsing with its own inner fire. Some of the symbols he recognized from his grandfather's stories, protection wards and binding spells from the old religion. Others were completely alien, their very shapes seeming to shift when he wasn't looking directly at them. At the center of the chamber sat a massive stone covered in more runes, its surface polished smooth by countless years. This was clearly no ordinary cave formation. The stone hummed with power, and as Bjorn approached it, the glowing runes responded to his presence, flaring brighter with each step. He could feel the heat radiating from the ancient carvings, see how they formed intricate patterns that spiraled toward the center of the monolith. When his fingers finally touched the runestone, the world exploded into light and sound. Visions crashed through his mind like storm waves, warriors in ancient armor standing guard in this very chamber, their faces grim with purpose. He saw rituals performed around the stone, blood spilled to bind something vast and terrible in the deeper darkness. Through it all, a voice spoke in his mind, not in words, but in emotions and images that bypassed language entirely. Asterisk Guardian. The blood calls to blood. The ancient compact stirs. Asterisk. Bjorn jerked his hand back, gasping. The visions faded, but their echoes remained, leaving him with the terrible certainty that whatever lay deeper in this cave system was aware of his presence. More than aware, it was pleased. A passage led away from the rune chamber, sloping downward into Stygian darkness. The blue glow from the symbols provided just enough light to reveal that the tunnel was not natural. Tool marks scored the walls where countless hands had carved this passage from solid rock, and the floor was worn smooth by the passage of many feet over many years. against every instinct screaming at him to climb back to the surface and seal this place forever. Bjorn found himself walking deeper into the earth. The whispers grew louder as he descended, taking on an almost conversational tone, as if multiple voices were debating his presence. The air grew colder, and his torch began to gutter and dance as invisible currents pulled at the flame. The passage opened into another chamber, this one vast enough that his torchlight couldn't reach the far walls. In the center, partially embedded in what looked like natural ice despite the underground location, was something that made Bjorn's blood freeze in his veins. An eye, massive beyond comprehension, easily the size of a wagon wheel, closed in apparent slumber behind a layer of crystalline ice. The lid was scaled and ancient, bearing scars that suggested this creature had seen battle on an unimaginable scale. Around the embedded form, more runes covered every available surface, these ones clearly meant as binding spells. The ice itself was carved with protective symbols, layer upon layer of magical safeguards meant to keep something imprisoned. As Bjorn stared at the frozen eye, it twitched. The movement was slight, barely perceptible, but unmistakable. Something vast and ancient lay sleeping beneath the ice, and his presence was beginning to wake it. The whispers in the air grew more urgent, taking on a pleading quality that transcended language. He could sense that whatever force had guided him to this place was trying to communicate something vital, something about responsibility and choice and sacrifice. The torch in his hand flickered and died, plunging him into darkness broken only by the blue glow of the runes. In that eerie light, Bjorn saw his reflection in the ice that imprisoned the creature, but for just a moment, the face looking back at him wasn't his own. It was younger, with different features but the same determined expression, the same broad shoulders. Someone who had stood in this exact spot long ago and faced the same choice that now confronted him. A sound echoed through the chamber, not quite breathing, not quite groaning, but something between the two. The creature was stirring, responding to his presence after what might have been centuries of slumber. Cracks appeared in the ice, hairline fractures that spread outward from where the massive eye rested. Bjorn turned and ran. He scrambled up the passage, through the rune chamber, and up the rope with a speed that would have impressed him in his younger days. Behind him, the whispers rose to a crescendo, and the blue glow of the runes flared so brightly that light spilled from the fissure like dawn breaking underground. At the surface, he lay gasping in his ruined barley field, staring up at clouds that seemed suddenly too bright, too normal after the alien darkness below. His hands shook as he untied the rope from the oak tree, and when he looked back at the fissure, he could still see the blue glow emanating from its depths. Whatever he had awakened down there, it wasn't going back to sleep. The peaceful farmer named Bjorn no longer existed. In his place stood a man who had touched ancient power and felt it recognize him as its own. The weight of that recognition settled on his shoulders like armor he'd thought he'd laid aside forever, and with it came the terrible understanding that his quiet life was ending whether he chose it or not. The creature beneath his farm was waking up, and when it did, everything he'd built here would be swept away like leaves before a winter storm. Sleep became impossible after that first descent into the cave. Every time Bjorn closed his eyes, he saw the massive frozen eye twitching behind its crystal prison, felt the weight of ancient recognition pressing against his mind like a physical force. 3 days had passed since the earth split open, and he'd spent most of that time pacing his farmhouse like a caged wolf, starting at every sound and jumping whenever the blue glow pulsed more brightly from the fissure. His animals refused to graze anywhere near the crack in the earth. Even his chickens, normally bold enough to peck at anything that moved, gave the area a wide berth, clustering instead around the barn as if seeking protection from whatever presence emanated from below. The local wildlife had fled entirely, no more rabbits in his vegetable garden, no birds nesting in his eaves. Even the insects seemed to have abandoned his property for safer ground. On the 4th morning, Bjorn finally admitted defeat. He needed answers, and the only place to find them was in the village of Thorvald, where old Magnus kept the largest collection of books and scrolls in 3 days' ride. Magnus had served as the village's informal scholar for over 40 years, collecting stories and knowledge the way other men collected silver. If anyone could shed light on the symbols Bjorn had seen carved into the cave walls, it would be him. The ride to Thorvald took longer than usual because Bjorn found himself constantly looking over his shoulder, certain that something was following him through the morning mist. His horse, normally steady and reliable, shied at shadows and whinnied nervously whenever they passed through stands of trees. The very air seemed different since the cave had opened thicker somehow, charged with potential like the moments before a lightning strike. Magnus lived in a stone cottage at the edge of the village, its walls lined floor to ceiling with scrolls, books, and tablets covered in runes from half a dozen different cultures. The old man himself was bent with age, his white beard reaching nearly to his knees, but his pale blue eyes were still sharp as winter ice. He took one look at Bjorn's haggard face and immediately set aside the manuscript he'd been studying. "Sit," Magnus commanded, pointing to a chair near his fireplace. "You look like a man who's seen something he wasn't meant to see." Bjorn settled into the offered chair, suddenly aware of how exhausted he was. "Magnus, what do you know about the old guardians? The warriors who served before the Christ followers came to our lands?" The scholar's eyebrows rose nearly to his hairline. "That's not a question a man asks lightly, Bjorn Eriksson. What has stirred up memories of the ancient compact?" "The earth beneath my farm has opened," Bjorn said carefully. "There are symbols carved in the rock below, runes I've never seen before. Some of them I recognize from childhood stories, but others," he shook his head, "others seem to move when I'm not looking directly at them." Magnus was quiet for a long moment, studying Bjorn's face with the intensity of a man reading important text. Finally he rose and began pulling scrolls from a high shelf, muttering to himself in the old language. "The Guardians," Magnus said as he spread the first scroll across his table, "were warriors chosen by blood and destiny to stand watch over the deep places. Before your great-grandfather's time, before the raids across the western seas, our people knew that some things must never be allowed to wake." The scroll contained drawings that made Bjorn's breath catch in his throat. Warriors in ancient armor, standing around stone chambers, their faces marked with the same runes he'd seen carved into the cave walls. At the center of each drawing was a figure bound in chains of ice and stone, its features too alien to be fully comprehended. "This creature," Bjorn said, pointing to the bound figure, "what was it?" "The scrolls call it many names," Magnus replied, unrolling another document. "The sleeper in the deep, the first hunger, the thing that waits." But its true name was lost when the last guardian died without passing on his knowledge. The old man's fingers traced symbols on the parchment. "What I can tell you is that it was not of this world. It came from the spaces between the stars, drawn by the warmth of living things and the taste of human dreams." Bjorn felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "And the guardians fought it?" "They couldn't fight it," Magnus said grimly. "Not in any way that matters. The creature was too powerful, too alien for mortal weapons to harm. Instead, they found another way, a binding that required constant vigilance, passed down from father to son through generations of warriors whose only purpose was to keep the thing asleep." The scholar spread out a third scroll, this one covered in family lineages written in fading ink. Bjorn leaned forward to study the names, and his blood turned to ice when he saw his own family line traced back through 20 generations. At the very beginning of the record, written in letters that seemed to glow faintly in the firelight, was a name he recognized from childhood stories, Bjorn the First, called the Guardian. "Your ancestor," Magnus said quietly, "was the one who forged the original binding. The magic required a sacrifice, not death, but something perhaps worse. He bound his bloodline to the creature's prison, ensuring that as long as his descendants lived, the seals would hold. But I left that life behind," Bjorn protested. "I became a farmer, a peaceful man. I haven't drawn a weapon in anger for 20 years." Magnus smiled sadly. The blood doesn't care what life you choose to live, my friend. The compact your ancestor made was with forces older than human civilization. When the time comes, and it always comes, the guardian must answer the call or watch everything he loves be devoured by ancient hunger. A new voice spoke from the doorway, startling both men. The time has come sooner than we hoped. Bjorn spun around to see a woman standing in the entrance to Magnus's cottage, though he was certain the door had been firmly closed moments before. She was perhaps 30 years old, with the pale skin and dark hair common to their region. But her eyes were different, silver like moonlight on water, with depths that suggested she'd seen far more than her apparent age would allow. "Who are you?" Bjorn demanded, his hand instinctively moving to where his sword would have hung in the old days. "My name is Ragnar," she said, stepping into the cottage with fluid grace. "I am the last of the seer bloodline, and I have been waiting for you to find your way to Magnus's door." She looked directly at Bjorn, and he felt those silver eyes seeing through to his very soul. "The creature stirs because it senses the Guardian's awakening. Every day you delay accepting your destiny is another day closer to its freedom." Magnus nodded gravely. The seers worked alongside the Guardians in the old days. They could see the threads of fate and guide the warriors when the binding required renewal. "Renewal?" Bjorn asked, though part of him already knew the answer would be something he didn't want to hear. Ragnar moved closer, and Bjorn caught a scent like winter wind and deep forests. "The binding your ancestor created was never meant to last forever. Every few generations, it must be renewed by a guardian of the bloodline, or the creature will break free and consume everything in its path." "What does renewal require?" Bjorn asked, though his warrior's instincts told him the answer would cost him everything he'd built in his peaceful life. "That," Ragnar said with something that might have been sympathy, "depends on how much you're willing to sacrifice to save the world you love." Outside Magnus's cottage, clouds gathered with unnatural speed, and the first drops of a storm that tasted of metal and ancient ice began to fall on the village of Thorvald. The storm that began at Magnus's cottage followed Bjorn home, growing fiercer with each mile he traveled. By the time he reached his farm, hail the size of chicken eggs was pounding the earth, and lightning split the sky in patterns that looked disturbingly like the runes he'd seen carved in the cave walls. His horse reared and refused to approach the fissure, forcing Bjorn to stable the animal and continue on foot through the unnatural tempest. The blue glow from the crack in his barley field had intensified, now bright enough to cast shadows even in the storm's darkness. As he drew closer, Bjorn could hear something that made his blood freeze, singing, voices from deep underground, harmonizing in a language that predated human speech, their melody both beautiful and utterly wrong. Against his better judgment, he found himself descending into the cave again, this time carrying a proper lantern along with his rope. The storm's fury seemed muted once he was below ground, replaced by the eerie chorus that echoed from the deeper chambers. The runestone in the first chamber was now blazing with such intensity that he could read by its light alone, and when he touched its surface, new visions flooded his mind. He saw the construction of this place not built, but grown from living rock by forces that shaped stone like clay. Warriors in armor, unlike anything from his people's history, stood guard as robed figures performed rituals that bound something vast and hungry in the deepest chambers. But these weren't the original guardians. These were their predecessors, the ones who had first discovered the creature and learned the terrible cost of keeping it contained. When the visions faded, Bjorn found himself standing in the deeper chamber, though he had no memory of walking there. The ice around the massive creature had developed new cracks, spider-webbing outward from where the enormous eye rested. Worse, he could now see more of the thing's form through the crystal prison scales, the size of shields, claws that could rend stone, and somewhere in the darkness beyond his lantern's reach, the suggestion of wings folded against a body too large for the chamber to fully contain. A sound behind him made him spin around, and his heart nearly stopped when he saw another figure emerging from a passage he hadn't noticed before. It was a man in ancient armor, his face hidden behind a helm crafted in the likeness of a snarling wolf. In his hands, he carried a bone horn covered in protective runes, its surface worn smooth by countless hands. "You should not be here alone," the figure said, his voice echoing strangely in the crystalline chamber. "The binding weakens, and the sleeper grows restless." Bjorn's hand moved instinctively to his belt, where a weapon should have hung. "Who are you? How did you get down here?" The armored figure removed his helm, revealing a face that was unmistakably related to Bjorn's own, the same broad features, the same blue eyes, though this man's hair was white as winter snow, and his skin bore the pallor of one who had not seen sunlight in many years. "I am Thorvald the Watcher," the man said, "though most above know me as old Thorvald, who died in his sleep 3 winters past." He gestured toward the frozen creature with the horn. "I have been keeping vigil since my death, maintaining the wards that your ancestor established. But my strength fades, and soon I will no longer be able to hold the binding." "You're supposed to be dead," Bjorn said, though even as he spoke the words, he realized how foolish they sounded in a place where ancient horrors slumbered behind walls of magical ice. Thorvald smiled grimly. "Death is just another form of service for those of the Guardian bloodline. When my mortal life ended, I chose to remain here rather than journey to whatever lies beyond. But even the dead grow weary, nephew, and my watch is ending, whether I will it or not." The revelation that this was his uncle, his father's older brother who had supposedly died peacefully in his bed, struck Bjorn like a physical blow. "Why didn't anyone tell me? Why was I allowed to live in ignorance?" "Because ignorance was a gift," Thorvald replied, settling the bone horn carefully against the chamber wall. "Every guardian hopes their children will be spared the burden. We pray that the binding will hold for another generation, that someone else's child will inherit the duty. But the blood always calls to blood, and destiny cannot be delayed forever." As if responding to their conversation, the creature behind the ice stirred more visibly. The massive eye twitched again, and this time Bjorn could swear he saw intelligence behind the scaled lid, an awareness vast and alien and utterly malevolent. "What does it want?" Bjorn asked, unable to look away from the imprisoned form. "Everything," Thorvald said simply. "It feeds on life force, on dreams, on the warm thoughts of living beings. If it were to break free, it would drain this world dry within a generation, leaving nothing but empty husks wandering a barren landscape." The horn in his uncle's hands began to glow with the same blue radiance as the runes, and Thorvald lifted it to his lips. The note that emerged was deeper than thunder, resonating through the stone itself and causing the ice around the creature to thicken slightly. But Bjorn could see the effort it cost his uncle. The old warrior's form became more translucent, with each breath expelled into the ancient instrument. "I can only do this a few more times," Thorvald said, when the horn's song faded. "The binding requires life force to maintain, and I have precious little of that remaining. You must decide quickly, nephew. Will you take up the Guardian's burden, or will you watch our world burn?" Before Bjorn could answer, a new voice echoed through the chamber, Ragnar's voice, though she was nowhere to be seen. "The choice has already been made for him. The creature's awakening has attracted others. Even now, they gather above ground, drawn by the stirring of ancient power." Bjorn looked up toward the cave entrance, and for the first time since discovering this place, he felt something other than fear. He felt anger. His peaceful life, his quiet farm, the simple existence he'd built from the ashes of his warrior days, all of it was being threatened by forces beyond his control. The familiar rage that had once made him legendary in battle began to kindle in his chest. "What others?" he demanded. Thorvald's ghostly form grew more solid, as if feeding off Bjorn's rising fury. Cultists who worship the old powers, mages seeking to bind the creature to their will, mercenaries hired by those who believe they can control what should never be unleashed, all of them drawn here by the weakening of the ancient seals. Through the cave entrance, Bjorn could now hear sounds that had nothing to do with the storm, the whinny of horses, the clank of armor, voices speaking in multiple languages as different groups converged on his farm. His sanctuary was being invaded, and with it, any hope of returning to his former life. The massive eye behind the ice opened completely, fixing its alien gaze directly on Bjorn. In that moment, he felt the creature's intelligence pressing against his mind, and he understood with perfect clarity that his choice was no choice at all. The Guardian bloodline had already decided his fate. The only question now was whether he would embrace his destiny willingly or be dragged into it by forces beyond his comprehension. Above ground, the first of the intruders had reached his farmhouse. The sound of splintering wood echoed down into the cave, as Bjorn's front door gave way to whoever had come calling in the storm. Thorvald's translucent form flickered with agitation, and the bone horn in his hands pulsed with urgent blue light. "They search for the entrance," his uncle whispered. "You must go. If they find you here unprepared, all is lost." Bjorn climbed toward the surface with the grim efficiency of a man who had finally accepted his fate. The peaceful farmer was dying with each step upward, replaced by something harder and more dangerous, not quite the berserker he'd once been, but no longer the gentle soul who had tended sheep and grown barley. At ground level, E could see torchlight moving through his farmhouse windows, at least 6 men, possibly more, searching his home with the methodical thoroughness of professionals. Their voices carried on the wind, mercenaries, speaking in the rough dialect of the Eastern Kingdoms, here for gold rather than glory. Bjorn circled wide around his property, using skills he'd thought forgotten to approach his barn unseen. Inside, wrapped in oiled leather and hidden beneath loose floorboards, were the tools of his former trade. His hands trembled slightly as he unwrapped the first bundle, revealing a mail shirt crafted by the finest smiths in Miklagard. The iron rings had been blessed by 3 different priests and quenched in the blood of his enemies, protection both physical and spiritual. The weight of the armor settling across his shoulders felt like coming home after a long exile. Muscle memory guided his movements as he secured the buckles and adjusted the fit. 20 years of farming had kept him strong, but the mail shirt revealed exactly how much his body had changed, still powerful, but broader now, more settled. The warrior's lean hardness had given way to a farmer's solid strength. His weapons came next. The CX at his belt, its single edge sharp enough to split hairs. A round shield bearing his family's arms, a wolf's head wreathed in flames, and finally, his legendary battle axe, its weight as familiar as his own heartbeat. The moment his fingers closed around the leather-wrapped handle, something fundamental shifted inside him. The rage that had made him famous across the northern seas stirred to life, controlled but unmistakable. A crash from the direction of his house told him the searchers had grown impatient. Through the barn's small window, he watched 3 figures emerge from his violated home, their leader carrying something that made Bjorn's blood boil. Ingrid's silver jewelry box, the one that held her few precious belongings. The red mist that had once made him legendary began to descend. These weren't just treasure hunters anymore, they were violating the memory of the woman he'd loved, defiling the sanctuary he'd built in her honor. The careful control he'd maintained for 2 decades began to crack like ice in a spring thaw. But before he could charge from the barn in righteous fury, a cool hand touched his shoulder. Ragnar materialized from the shadows, as if she'd been carved from moonlight and mist. "Not yet," she said quietly. "Your anger serves the cause, but blind rage will not. There are more of them than you know, and they are not the greatest threat you face tonight." "They're in my house," Bjorn growled, his voice rougher than it had been in years. "Touching her things." "I know," Ragnar said with genuine sympathy. "But look beyond your immediate fury and see what I see." She touched his forehead with fingers that felt like winter wind, and suddenly Bjorn's vision expanded beyond the normal range of human sight. He could see heat signatures through walls, detect the life force of every living thing within a mile of his farm. The mercenaries in his house numbered 8, not 6. 2 more were hidden outside as sentries. But they were the least of his concerns. To the north, another group approached on horseback, 12 riders in black robes, their faces hidden, but their purposes radiating malevolent hunger. These were not mere treasure hunters. The dark energy that surrounded them marked them as practitioners of the forbidden arts, mages who sought to bind the ancient creature to their own twisted will. From the south came something worse, a lone figure walking through the storm, as if the lightning and hail were gentle rain. Even from this distance, Bjorn could sense the wrongness about this individual. It moved like a human, but felt like something pretending to be human, a hollow shell, animated by will rather than life. "The blood-bound shield," Ragnar said, pressing something into his hands. "Your ancestor left it for this moment." Bjorn looked down to see an ancient shield, its surface covered in runes that seemed to writhe and shift in the torchlight. Unlike his family's traditional round shield, this was rectangular and heavier, forged from metals that didn't exist in any earthly mine. The moment his fingers touched the ancient leather grip, knowledge flooded his mind, not memories, but understanding. This shield had been carried by the first guardian, blessed with power drawn from the creature's own essence. It could turn aside not just physical weapons, but magical attacks, and more importantly, it could channel the Guardian's strength into devastating offensive strikes. But using it came with a price each time the shield's power was invoked. It bound the wielder more closely to his destiny as Guardian. "The mercenaries are tools," Ragnar explained, her silver eyes reflecting the shield's runic glow. "Someone hired them to create chaos, to draw your attention while the real threats moved into position. The mages seek to corrupt the binding, to twist it so the creature serves them rather than remaining imprisoned. The Hollow One," she shuddered. "That was once a guardian who refused his duty. The creature claimed him anyway, but left him as a warning to others." Through the shield's enhanced awareness, Bjorn could feel the massive presence stirring deeper underground. The creature was feeding off the violence and magical energy gathering above its prison, growing stronger with each moment that passed. Soon, it would be powerful enough to break free entirely, unless the Guardian bloodline fulfilled its ancient compact. "What exactly does the ritual require?" Bjorn asked, though part of him already suspected the answer would be more terrible than death. Ragnar's expression grew solemn. The Guardian must take the creature's place in the binding, not dead, but not truly alive, either a conscious prison, holding the creature trapped through force of will and sacrifice of everything that made him human. The knowledge hit him like a physical blow. His ancestor hadn't died, creating the binding, he had become it, spending eternity in conscious imprisonment to keep the creature contained. Every guardian who had renewed the compact had made the same choice, trading their humanity for the world's safety. The storm above intensified, and through the barn walls, Bjorn could hear the mercenaries calling to each other as they discovered the fissure in his barley field. Soon, all 3 groups would converge on the cave entrance, and the careful balance that had kept the creature contained for generations would shatter completely. Bjorn hefted the blood-bound shield and felt his family's battle-axe sing with anticipation. He was no longer a farmer trying to protect his quiet life. He was a guardian, preparing for the last battle of his mortal existence, and the rage building in his chest was no longer personal. It was righteous, terrible, and completely without mercy. The seer's crystal pendant caught the storm's lightning as she pressed it into Bjorn's palm, its faceted surface warm despite the icy wind. The moment his fingers closed around the ancient gem, visions crashed through his consciousness with the force of a tidal wave, not chaotic fragments this time, but a complete and terrible understanding of what was to come. He saw himself as he would be after accepting the Guardian's burden, not dead, but transformed into something between man and spirit, bound eternally to the creature's prison. His consciousness would remain intact, aware of every passing moment through centuries of imprisonment, feeling the creature's constant pressure against his will, like a weight that could never be lifted. He would watch the world change around him, see generations of his people live and die, all while maintaining the mental strength to keep an ancient horror contained. But the visions showed him more than just his own fate. He saw the aftermath if he refused the creature breaking free in an explosion of malevolent energy that would shatter the binding completely. Cities would fall within days as the thing's hunger consumed every living soul it encountered. The dead would rise as hollow shells, animated by the creature's will, and sent forth to spread its influence across the known world. Within a generation, nothing would remain but wasteland populated by empty vessels that had once been human. "Now you understand why your ancestor made the choice he did," Ragnar said softly as the visions faded, "not out of duty or honor, but out of love for everything that would be lost if he failed." The crystal pendant grew heavier in his hand, and Bjorn realized it wasn't just showing him possible futures, it was showing him the past as well. Through its mystical lens, he could see the echo of every guardian who had come before, each one making the same terrible choice when their time came. His grandfather, who had supposedly died in a hunting accident, his great-grandfather, lost in a storm at sea, all lies told to protect their families from the truth of their sacrifice. Thunder crashed overhead, but now Bjorn could distinguish between the natural storm and the supernatural energies building around his farm. The mercenaries had found the cave entrance and were preparing to descend with torches and weapons. The black-robed mages had completed some kind of ritual circle in his pasture, their chanting adding an ominous harmony to the wind's howling. And the hollow guardian, the one who had refused his duty, was approaching the farmhouse with steps that left frost in the muddy ground. "How long do I have?" Bjorn asked, securing the crystal pendant around his neck, where it rested against Ingrid's silver ring. "Until dawn," Ragnar replied. "The creature's power waxes with the dark hours, but the binding ritual can only be completed when the first light touches the guardian stone. You have perhaps 6 hours to prepare yourself and clear away those who would interfere. 6 hours to say goodbye to everything he had been and accept everything he must become." Bjorn looked out at his farm, the fields he had ploughed with his own hands, the barn he had built board by board, the well where he had seen his reflection change from warrior to farmer. All of it would remain, but he would never again be the man who had found peace in simple things. A scream echoed from the direction of the cave, followed by the sound of running feet. One of the mercenaries burst from the fissure, his eyes wide with terror and his hair turned white as winter snow. He babbled something about voices in the dark and eyes that followed him through stone walls before collapsing in the mud, his mind shattered by whatever he had witnessed in the depths. "The creature grows stronger," Ragnar observed. "Its influence spreads beyond the physical barriers as the binding weakens. Soon it will be able to touch the minds of anyone who ventures too close." Through the crystal's enhanced perception, Bjorn could see the truth of her words. Dark tendrils of psychic energy were seeping from the cave entrance like smoke, seeking out the life force of anything nearby. The remaining mercenaries were fighting the creature's mental influence, but their will was weakening with each passing moment. Soon they would become mindless thralls, adding their strength to the thing's growing power. The mages in the pasture seemed immune to the mental assault, protected by wards and rituals that deflected the creature's attention. But their immunity came at a cost. Bjorn could see how the dark magic they wielded was slowly corrupting their souls, turning them into something as monstrous as the thing they sought to control. "I need to reach the village," Bjorn said suddenly. "Warn them to evacuate before this spreads any further." Ragnar shook her head. "There is no time, and nowhere far enough to run. If the binding fails completely, the creature's influence will spread across the entire realm within hours. Your only choice is to complete the ritual before that happens." A new sound cut through the storm, the bonehorn's deep note rising from the cave depths. Thorvald was using his remaining strength to reinforce the weakening seals, but Bjorn could hear the exhaustion in that ancient song. His uncle's ghostly vigil was ending, whether by choice or necessity. "There is something else you must know," Ragnar said, her silver eyes reflecting depths of sorrow that seemed far older than her apparent years. "The Guardian's sacrifice is not just about imprisonment. Each one who takes on the burden adds his strength to those who came before. Your ancestor still endures within the binding, along with your grandfather and all the others. You will not be alone in the dark. Their spirits will share the burden and help you maintain the seals." The revelation brought both comfort and horror. He would have companionship in his eternal prison, but it would be the company of men who had made the same terrible choice, bound together in an endless vigil against ancient evil. They would share not just the burden but the isolation, the constant pressure of holding back something that never stopped trying to break free. Another mercenary emerged from the cave, this one laughing with the mad glee of someone whose sanity had snapped completely. He began attacking his own companions, possessed by the creature's malevolent will. The remaining men fled toward the mage's ritual circle, seeking protection they would not find. Bjorn gripped his battle axe and felt the blood-bound shield respond to his rising determination. The farmer was truly dead now, burned away by the terrible knowledge of what he must become. In his place stood something harder and more purposeful, not quite the berserker of his youth, but not entirely human either. He was becoming the bridge between mortal man and eternal guardian, and the transformation was as painful as it was necessary. "When the time comes," he said to Ragnar, "will you tell them I chose this willingly? Let them remember that someone chose to stand between them and the dark." The seer nodded, tears like liquid silver streaming down her cheeks. "I will remember, and I will make sure the world remembers. The Guardian's sacrifice will not be forgotten." Dawn was still hours away, but Bjorn could already feel the weight of eternity settling on his shoulders like a cloak made of starlight and sorrow. The truth came to Bjorn not as a gradual revelation, but as a thunderbolt of understanding that nearly drove him to his knees. He was standing at the edge of the cave, preparing to descend for what he believed would be the final time, when the crystal pendant around his neck flared with brilliant light. In that illumination, he saw something that changed everything he thought he knew about the creature, the Guardians, and his own destiny. The massive form imprisoned in the ice was not some alien horror from beyond the stars. It was a man, or rather, it had once been a man, transformed by the very binding ritual that was supposed to contain him. Through the crystal's revealing light, Bjorn could see past the scales and claws to the human features beneath, features that bore an unmistakable resemblance to his own family line. "By all the gods," he whispered, understanding flooding through him like ice water in his veins. "That's him. That's the first Guardian." Ragnar appeared beside him, as if materializing from the storm itself, her silver eyes reflecting his horrified realization. "Now you begin to see the true nature of the compact your bloodline made." "He didn't bind the creature," Bjorn said, his voice hollow with shock. "He became it. The ritual doesn't imprison some alien thing. It transforms the Guardian into the very monster he's supposed to contain." "The corruption was gradual," Ragnar explained, her voice heavy with centuries of sorrow. "Your ancestor volunteered to become the vessel for an ancient evil, believing he could contain it through force of will. For a time, he succeeded. But the thing he held within himself was patient and cunning. Generation by generation, it wore away at his humanity until only the shell remained." The implications crashed through Bjorn's mind like falling stones. Every Guardian who had renewed the binding hadn't been maintaining a prison, they had been feeding themselves to the creature, adding their strength to its growing power while believing they were heroes, saving the world. "The other Guardians," he said, thinking of Thorvald's ghostly form in the cave below. "They're not helping to maintain the seals. They're trapped inside it, part of its consciousness now." "Your uncle still fights," Ragnar said softly. "His will is stronger than most, which is why he could manifest as a separate spirit for a time. But even now, his essence is being drawn back into the collective that serves the creature's hunger." Bjorn stared into the fissure, where the blue glow was growing brighter and more urgent. The thing down there wasn't trying to break free. It was trying to lure him close enough to complete the process that had begun with his first touch of the Guardian Stone. Every moment he spent near the cave, every vision the crystal pendant showed him, was part of an elaborate deception designed to make him willingly surrender his humanity. "The soul-binding chain," he said, remembering what Ragnar had called it earlier. "It's not a weapon to contain the creature, it's the mechanism by which it claims new guardians." "The chain exists," Ragnar confirmed, "but not as you were led to believe. It binds the guardian's soul to the creature's will, ensuring that each new sacrifice becomes part of its collective consciousness while believing they are performing a noble duty." The horn's deep note rose from the cave again, but now Bjorn could hear the deception in its song. What he had taken for his uncle's strength was actually the creature calling to him in Thorvald's voice, using his family loyalty as bait to draw him into the depths where the binding ritual could be completed. "Why are you telling me this?" Bjorn demanded, his grip tightening on his battle axe. "If you're part of the seer bloodline, shouldn't you be trying to trick me into accepting my destiny?" Ragnar's expression grew fierce, and for the first time, Bjorn saw the warrior spirit that lay beneath her mystical demeanor. "My bloodline has served as unwilling accomplices to this deception for centuries. We were bound by ancient oaths to guide each guardian to his fate, unable to speak the truth, even when we desperately wanted to. But the binding that held our tongues broke when the creature began to transform too rapidly. Its hunger has grown beyond what the original compact could contain." She pulled back her sleeve, revealing intricate scars that covered her arm, from wrist to shoulder, not decorative markings, but ritual cuts that had been carved into her flesh over many years. "Every lie I was forced to tell, every guardian I led to his doom, left its mark," she said. "But the scars also weakened the creature's hold over my bloodline. 3 generations ago, my grandmother began to remember. 2 generations ago, my mother started keeping records. And I finally found a way to break free of the compact entirely." The storm around them intensified, but now Bjorn understood that it wasn't natural weather. The creature was responding to Ragnar's revelation with fury, lashing out with the power it had accumulated from centuries of consuming guardians. Lightning struck the ground near their feet, and the very air seemed to thicken with malevolent pressure. "If the binding ritual is a trap," Bjorn said, "then how do we actually stop this thing?" "We don't," Ragnar said grimly. "The creature is too powerful now, fed by the souls of too many guardians to be destroyed by any conventional means. But we can prevent it from claiming you, which means it will eventually exhaust its current store of energy and return to dormancy. For how long? Perhaps a century, perhaps less, but long enough for us to find another way, to research a true solution, instead of perpetuating the cycle of sacrifice." The blue glow from the cave suddenly flared like a second sun, and the ground beneath their feet heaved as something massive began to move in the depths. The creature was running out of patience. Soon it would abandon subtlety and try to claim Bjorn by force, regardless of whether he willingly entered the cave. "The mercenaries and mages," Bjorn said, understanding dawning. "They're not here to capture or control the creature. They're here to drive me toward it, to create enough chaos that I'll feel compelled to attempt the binding ritual. All unknowing servants," Ragnar confirmed. "The creature's influence has been growing for months, subtly guiding events to bring everyone to this place at this time. It orchestrated its own awakening to force the choice upon you." A new sound emerged from the depths, not the horn's song, but something far more terrible. It was laughter, vast and alien and filled with cruel amusement. The creature had realized that its deception was unraveling, and it no longer cared about maintaining the pretense of noble duty and heroic sacrifice. Bjorn felt the weight of destiny settle around him, but it was different now, not the burden of accepting a necessary sacrifice, but the responsibility of finding a way to break a cycle of deception that had claimed his bloodline for generations. The farmer in him was long dead, and the guardian he was supposed to become was revealed as a lie. What remained was something harder to define: a man who had seen through an ancient deception and chosen to fight against it, regardless of the cost. The soul-binding chain might be real, but it would not claim him willingly. If the creature wanted another guardian to feed its endless hunger, it would have to take him by force. And Bjorn the Giant, farmer and warrior and free man, intended to make that as difficult as possible. The ancient stone altar emerged from the storm-soaked earth like a bone rising from a grave, its surface covered in runes that pulsed with the same malevolent blue light as the cave below. Ragnar guided Bjorn to it through the chaos of wind and lightning, her silver eyes reflecting knowledge accumulated over generations of careful planning. "This is where the true binding can take place," she said, pressing her hands against the weathered stone. "Not the false ritual that would make you the creature's next meal, but the guardian's oath, the original compact that your ancestor was supposed to make before the creature corrupted him." The oath stone was smaller than Bjorn had expected, barely the size of a grinding wheel, but he could feel the power radiating from its ancient surface. Unlike the corrupted runes in the cave below, these symbols felt clean somehow, purposeful rather than hungry. They spoke of duty freely chosen rather than fate imposed by deception. "What does the real oath require?" Bjorn asked, though he suspected the answer would be no less terrible than what he'd believed before. "Your life," Ragnar said simply, "but not your soul. The true guardian doesn't become a prison for the creature, he becomes its executioner. The oath binds your life force to the task of destroying the thing completely, burning it away with the pure fire of willing sacrifice." She ran her fingers along the stone's edge, and the runes began to glow more brightly in response to her touch. "Your ancestor was supposed to die in the original ritual, taking the creature with him into whatever lies beyond death. Instead, he chose to try containing it, believing he could have both heroism and survival. That choice doomed every guardian who came after." The ground beneath the altar trembled as something vast moved in the cave below. The creature was growing impatient, its influence spreading outward like ripples in a dark pond. In the distance, Bjorn could hear the mages chanting with increasing desperation as their protective circles began to fail. The mercenaries had either fled or succumbed to madness, their screams adding a discordant harmony to the storm's howling. "How do you know this will work?" Bjorn demanded. "How can you be certain the real ritual will destroy the creature instead of just feeding it another guardian?" Ragnar smiled, and for the first time since he'd met her, the expression reached her silver eyes. "Because I'm not just the last of the seer bloodline," she said. "I'm also the daughter of the last true guardian, the one who died trying to warn your grandfather about the deception." She pulled a leather cord from around her neck, revealing a pendant that made Bjorn's breath catch in his throat. It was a fragment of metal that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly. But unlike the corrupted runes below ground, these markings felt right somehow, as if they belonged to a cleaner age when heroes died for causes worth dying for. "My father discovered the truth 20 years too late to save himself," Ragnar continued, "but he managed to preserve this, a piece of the original binding stone, the one your ancestor was supposed to use. It still holds the true power, untainted by the creature's corruption." The pendant in her hands began to resonate with the oath stone, and suddenly Bjorn could see the ritual as it was meant to be performed. Not the elaborate deception that lured guardians into the creature's embrace, but a simple and terrible ceremony that would channel all of his life force into a single moment of absolute destruction. "I'll die the moment I complete it," he said, understanding flooding through him like cold water. "Yes," Ragnar confirmed, "but the creature will die with you, truly and completely, and your bloodline will finally be free of the burden they've carried for generations." A new sound rose from the cave, not laughter this time, but rage. The creature had sensed the presence of the true oath stone, and its fury shook the very foundations of the earth. Cracks appeared in the ground around the altar, spreading outward like a spider's web of fractures. Soon, the thing would abandon all pretense and emerge from its lair to claim what it believed was rightfully its. "There's something else," Ragnar said, her voice barely audible above the storm's roar. "The ritual requires not just your willing sacrifice, but the presence of someone to witness and guide the process. Someone who understands the true nature of what you're attempting." Bjorn looked at her silver eyes and saw the knowledge there, not just of the ritual's requirements, but of what it would cost her to serve as witness. "You'll die too. The seer's bloodline was always meant to end with this ritual," she said calmly. "We've served as unwilling accomplices to centuries of deception. This is our chance to finally fulfill our true purpose and break the cycle forever." The weight of what she was offering hit Bjorn like a physical blow. She was asking him to not only give up his own life, but to accept responsibility for hers as well. Two bloodlines, both ancient and proud, would end on this storm-swept hilltop to save a world that would never know what they had sacrificed. "Are you certain?" he asked. "There's no other way." "None," Ragnar said firmly. "The creature has grown too powerful for anything less than absolute sacrifice. But think of what that sacrifice will buy your nephew's children, will grow up free of the Guardian's burden. My sister's daughters will live ordinary lives, unmarked by mystical duty. The world will be safer because we chose to end this tonight." Lightning split the sky directly overhead, and in its brief illumination, Bjorn could see the truth written in Ragnar's face. She had been planning this moment for years, perhaps decades, carrying the knowledge of what would be required while waiting for the right guardian to arrive. She had guided him to this point, not out of ancient obligation, but out of love for a world that deserved freedom from inherited curses. The blue glow from the cave entrance was now bright enough to cast shadows even in the storm's darkness, and the ground vibrations had become so intense that standing upright required constant effort. The creature was preparing to emerge, driven by desperation and rage, to abandon the subtlety that had served it for centuries. "How long do we have?" Bjorn asked, settling his battle axe across his back and placing both hands on the oath stone. "Until it breaks free completely," Ragnar said, moving to stand at the stone's opposite edge. "Perhaps minutes, perhaps less, but once we begin the ritual, time will become meaningless. The true binding exists outside the normal flow of moments we'll have as long as we need to complete the work." The pendant around her neck was now glowing with the same clean light as the oath stone, and Bjorn could feel power building between them like the charge before lightning strikes. This was different from the corrupt energy that emanated from the cave. This felt like sunlight concentrated into physical form, warm and purposeful, and completely without mercy. "One last thing," Ragnar said, as she began the opening words of the ritual in a language that predated human speech. "Whatever you see when the binding takes hold, whatever the creature shows you to try breaking your resolve, remember that it's all lies. Your true memories, your real love for this world, those will be what give the ritual its power." The oath stone grew warm beneath Bjorn's palms, and he felt the first stirrings of the transformation that would either save the world or doom it. In the distance, something enormous was clawing its way toward the surface, driven by hunger that had been building for centuries. Soon there would be only the ritual, the creature, and the choice between salvation bought with willing sacrifice or damnation earned through the failure of courage. Bjorn closed his eyes, thought of Ingrid's smile and the peaceful mornings on his farm, and began to speak the words that would end both his life and the ancient evil that had claimed his bloodline for far too long. The earth exploded upward as the creature finally abandoned all pretense of subtlety. What emerged from the shattered remains of Bjorn's barley field was a nightmare given form 20 feet of scaled horror that had once been human. Its massive frame, bearing the twisted remnants of his ancestors' features beneath layers of corruption that had accumulated over centuries of feeding on guardian souls. The transformation gauntlets materialized on Bjorn's hands as he spoke the ritual words, ancient metal flowing like liquid to cover his forearms with plates of starlight and purpose. The moment the gauntlet settled into place, he felt the true power of the guardian bloodline, awakening not the false strength that would have made him the creature's next meal, but the clean fire of willing sacrifice that could burn away even the oldest evil. "Kinsman," the creature spoke, its voice a chorus of every guardian it had consumed over the centuries. Bjorn could hear his grandfather's tone within that horrible harmony, along with Thorvald's steady strength and dozens of other family voices twisted by corruption. "You come to join us at last." "I come to end you," Bjorn replied, the gauntlets channeling his words into a declaration that rang like hammer strikes against anvil. "I come to free every soul you've devoured and break the chain of deception that has bound my bloodline for too long." The creature's laughter shook the very air, and when it moved, Bjorn could see the ghostly forms of consumed guardians writhing within its scaled hide like prisoners behind glass. Some still fought against their incorporation into its consciousness, their faces twisted with effort as they tried to maintain their individual identity within the collective nightmare they had become. "Look at what you face," the creature said, gesturing with claws that could rend stone. "Every hero of your line dwells within me now. Their strength is my strength. Their knowledge is my knowledge. What can one farmer hope to accomplish against the combined might of 20 generations?" The answer came not from Bjorn's lips, but from the oath stone itself, speaking through him in words that blazed with the authority of absolute truth. "A farmer knows that some fields must be burned to stop the spread of blight." Power flowed through the transformation gauntlets, and suddenly Bjorn was moving with speed that defied his massive frame. His battle axe sang through the air, its edge now wreathed in the same clean fire that emanated from the oath stone. The blow that would have taken a normal man's head from his shoulders merely scored the creature's scaled hide, but where the blessed metal touched, corruption began to burn away like frost before sunrise. The creature recoiled with a shriek that shattered every window in the abandoned farmhouse, its massive form coiling with serpentine grace as it prepared to strike back. When it moved, Bjorn saw the true scope of what his ancestor had become, not just physically transformed, but expanded beyond the limits of mortal flesh into something that existed partially in the realm of spirit. Claws raked through the air where Bjorn had been standing, but the gauntlets had granted him more than strength. They had given him the ability to partially exist in the same spiritual realm as his enemy. He flowed around the creature's strike like smoke, his axe finding gaps in its armor that shouldn't have existed. "The guardians you consumed," Bjorn said as he landed a blow that sent scales flying like black snow. "They're still fighting you from within. I can see them weakening your movements, making you hesitate at crucial moments." It was true. Every time the creature prepared to use its full power, Bjorn could see the ghostly forms of his ancestors interfering with its concentration. They couldn't break free entirely, but they could still choose to hinder rather than help their captor. Grandfather Eric's spirit was wrapped around one of the thing's legs, slowing its movements. Thorvald's essence clouded its vision at critical moments. Even the first guardian, buried deepest in the corruption, was fighting to remember who he had been before the creature claimed him. "They serve me now," the creature roared, but there was uncertainty in its voice. "Their wills are mine to command." "Their wills were never yours," Bjorn replied, dodging another massive swipe and landing a blow that bit deep into the creature's shoulder. "You deceived them into joining you, but deception is not mastery. And now they know the truth." The transformation gauntlets pulsed with increasing power as the ritual continued, each exchange of blows strengthening the connection between Bjorn and the oath stone. He could feel his life force being drawn into the cleansing fire that would eventually consume both him and his enemy. But the process was gradual, allowing him to fight at full strength while the binding took hold. Ragnar's voice rose behind him, speaking words in the ancient tongue that made the very air shimmer with purpose. She was guiding the ritual's progression, ensuring that the power building within Bjorn would reach its full potential before his physical strength failed. But he could hear the cost in her voice. Each word she spoke was burning away another year of her life, aging her rapidly as she channeled forces meant to be handled by entire bloodlines rather than single individuals. The creature seemed to sense the true threat the ritual represented because its attacks became more desperate, less calculated. It began drawing on powers that it had hoarded for centuries, unleashing blasts of corrupted energy that turned the storm clouds above them black as pitch. Where its power touched the ground, the earth itself withered and died, leaving patches of absolute sterility that would never again support life. But the transformation gauntlets absorbed each blast, converting the creature's own corrupt energy into fuel for the cleansing fire. The more power it expended trying to destroy Bjorn, the stronger the ritual became. It was trapped in a cycle of its own, making too weak to simply overwhelm him physically, too proud to retreat, and too corrupted to realize that every attack was hastening its own destruction. "This is how it ends," Bjorn said, as his axe found its mark again, this time biting deep enough to draw the black ichor that served as the creature's blood. Not with deception or false sacrifice, but with truth freely chosen and prices willingly paid. The creature's roar of rage shook the foundation stones of the earth itself, but beneath that sound, Bjorn could hear something else, the voices of his consumed ancestors, no longer fighting alone, but singing in harmony with the ritual's power. They had finally found a way to turn their imprisonment into weapon, their suffering into strength for the one guardian who had come to set them free. The guardian's heartstone emerged from the oath altar as Bjorn placed his palm against its ancient surface, the mystical gem pulsing with a rhythm that matched his own heartbeat. The moment their life forces synchronized, he felt the true weight of what the ritual demanded, not just his death, but the willing surrender of everything that made him who he was. "Now," Ragnar gasped, her hair turned white as winter snow from the effort of guiding the ritual. "The binding must be completed now, while you still have the strength to choose." The heartstone was warm against Bjorn's palm, and through its crystalline surface he could see the faces of every guardian who had ever lived, not as the consumed spirits trapped within the creature, but as they had been in life, proud and strong and unbroken by the deception that had claimed them. They were waiting for him on the other side of sacrifice, ready to welcome him into whatever peace awaited those who died in service to something greater than themselves. The creature sensed the change in the ritual's power and abandoned all pretense of combat strategy. It threw itself at Bjorn with the desperate fury of something that finally understood it faced extinction, its massive claws seeking to tear him away from the altar before the binding could be completed. But the transformation gauntlets had become something more than armor. They were conduits now, channeling the combined will of every guardian into Bjorn's actions. When he raised his battle-axe to meet the creature's charge, 20 generations of warriors guided the blade's path. The blow that connected was delivered with the skill of his grandfather, the strength of his great-grandfather, and the righteous fury of the first guardian, finally freed from corruption's hold. The creature's shriek as the blessed steel bit deep into its chest was unlike anything that had ever echoed across the mortal realm. It was the sound of centuries of accumulated evil being burned away by pure intention, of lies finally confronted by truth, of a cycle of deception ending in fire and freedom. Black ichor poured from the wound, but where it touched the ground around the oath altar, the corruption was immediately consumed by cleansing flame. The Heartstone's power was spreading outward, creating a zone of absolute purification that the creature could no longer escape. "I see you now," Bjorn said as the ritual's power flowed through him like molten gold. "I see what you really are, not some ancient evil from beyond the stars, but the fear that lives in every guardian's heart. The fear that our sacrifice won't matter, that our suffering serves no purpose, that we'll be forgotten and our pain will be meaningless." The creature's attacks grew weaker as the Heartstone's influence spread, its massive form beginning to dissolve at the edges like smoke in sunlight. Within its writhing mass, Bjorn could see the trapped spirits of his ancestors finally beginning to separate from their captor's consciousness, their faces peaceful for the first time in generations. But sacrifice does matter, Bjorn continued, feeling his own life force flowing into the stone with each word. Not because it buys us glory or remembrance, but because it's the choice that proves we're more than our fears. When we willingly give up everything we are to protect what we love, we become something greater than human. We become the bridge between what is and what should be. Ragnar's voice rose in the final verse of the ritual, words that seemed to come from the stone itself rather than her throat. As she spoke, the Guardian's heartstone flared with light that turned night into day, and Bjorn felt the last of his mortality burning away in that radiance. The creature made one final attempt to break free, lunging toward the village in the distance, as if it could still escape to spread its corruption across the world. But the binding was complete now, the Heartstone's power extending as far as the creature's influence had ever reached. When Bjorn's battle-axe met the creature's neck in the final blow, it was not one man striking down a monster, it was the collected will of every guardian who had ever lived, channeled through their willing representative into a moment of absolute justice. The creature's head separated from its shoulders in an explosion of light that could be seen for miles, and as its body collapsed into ash and memory, 20 generations of imprisoned spirits rose from the remains like stars returning to the sky. Bjorn fell to his knees beside the oath altar, the Heartstone's power having consumed everything that made him mortal, while leaving behind something harder to define. He was dying, but he was also becoming something eternal, not a guardian bound to fight endless battles, but a protector whose sacrifice had ended the need for guardians altogether. "It's done," he whispered as Ragnar knelt beside him, her own life force fading as the ritual reached its conclusion. The bloodline is free. Around them, the storm was ending, the clouds breaking apart to reveal stars that seemed brighter than they had been in centuries. The creature was gone, not imprisoned or contained, but truly destroyed, and with it had died the curse that had bound the guardian bloodline to endless vigilance. In the distance, the first light of dawn touched the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that promised a new day for a world finally free from ancient fears. 3 seasons had passed since the night the earth split open beneath Bjorn's farm, and the village of Thorvald had settled into a prosperity that seemed almost magical in its abundance. The fields around the former battlefield yielded crops twice as rich as any in living memory. The livestock were healthier and more numerous, and even the weather had turned gentle, as if the land itself was celebrating its freedom from ancient shadows. Young Gunnar, Eric's son, now tended the farm that had once belonged to Bjorn the Giant. The boy had grown into the responsibility with surprising maturity, guided by memories that seemed to come from the earth itself, knowledge of when to plant, how to care for the animals, and which fields needed rest. The local folks whispered that Bjorn's spirit still watched over the land, blessing those who worked it with honest hearts. The farmhouse had been rebuilt after the storm damage, but Gunnar had left one room exactly as it had been found. A small chamber where a dusty battle-axe hung on the wall above a simple wooden table. On that table sat a silver jewelry box that had belonged to a woman named Ingrid, its contents never disturbed, and beside it rested a crystal pendant that sometimes caught the light in ways that seemed to reveal distant visions. Astrid the wise woman visited the farm often, bringing honey from her beehives and stories for Gunnar to remember. She never spoke directly of what had happened that terrible night, but she made sure the boy understood that he was the caretaker of something sacred, not just land, but legacy. "The bees know things," she would say as she watched them work the flowers that grew more abundantly each year. "They remember when the air was thick with old sorrows, and they celebrate that those sorrows have passed. This place is blessed now, child. Blessed by sacrifice freely given and love freely shared. The new guardian's blessing manifested in countless small ways throughout the valley. Children played without fear in places that had once felt haunted. The elderly slept peacefully, untroubled by nightmares that had plagued them for generations. Even the wild animals seemed gentler, more trusting of human presence. Magnus the scholar had taken on a new apprentice, a young woman with silver eyes and prematurely white hair who had appeared in the village shortly after the great storm. She claimed to be the last survivor of a family line that had served the old ways, seeking to learn new purposes now that the ancient duties were finally ended. Magnus never questioned her story, though he sometimes caught her staring into the distance with the expression of someone who remembered things that had never happened to her directly. The woman called herself simply the Keeper, and she spent her days recording the true history of what had occurred, not the legend of a monster defeated by a hero, but the more complex story of a man who had chosen love over fear, sacrifice over survival, and truth over comfortable deception. Her chronicles would ensure that future generations understood not just what had been accomplished, but why it had been necessary. On the anniversary of that terrible night, the entire village gathered at the site where the oath altar had stood. The stone itself had crumbled to dust when the ritual ended, but the ground where it had rested remained sacred, a circle of earth where flowers bloomed year-round, and the very air seemed lighter somehow. Gunnar would stand at the center of that circle and speak the words Astrid had taught him. We remember Bjorn the Giant, who was first a warrior, then a farmer, and finally a guardian. We remember Ragnar the seer, who chose truth over ancient obligation. We remember all those who came before, who thought they failed but truly succeeded. We remember, and we are grateful. The blessing was strongest at dawn, when the morning light first touched the memorial circle. In those moments, some claimed they could see figures standing just beyond the edge of vision, a massive man with gentle eyes, a woman with silver hair and a knowing smile, and behind them the shadows of 20 generations finally at peace. Children born since that night grew up in a world subtly different from the one their parents had known. They faced the normal challenges of life, illness, hardship, loss, and struggle, but they did so without the weight of inherited curses or the fear of ancient evils stirring in the deep places. They were free to write their own destinies, unburdened by the sins and sorrows of their ancestors. Gunnar often worked his fields until sunset, and in the evening twilight he would sometimes see a massive figure standing at the edge of the pasture, watching over the sheep with the patience of a man who had found his purpose. The figure never approached, never spoke, but its presence was a comfort rather than a bane. Fear, a reminder that some loves are stronger than death, and some duties transcend the boundary between worlds. The farm prospered under Gunnar's care, but its true wealth was not measured in grain or gold. It was measured in the laughter of children who played without looking over their shoulders, in the deep sleep of elders no longer troubled by inherited nightmares, and in the simple fact that a young man could tend his fields without wondering what ancient evil might be stirring beneath his feet. The cycle of guardians was ended, the bloodline freed from its burden, and the world made safe, not through endless vigilance, but through the willing sacrifice of one man who chose to end a legacy of deception rather than perpetuate it. In the village of Thorvald, they remembered that choice every day, and they were grateful. And sometimes, when the morning mist rose from the fields and the light fell just right across the memorial circle, travelers claimed they could hear the sound of distant singing, not the alien chanting that had once echoed from deep places, but the warm harmony of voices raised in celebration of a duty finally, completely, and forever fulfilled. The guardian's sacrifice was not forgotten, and the world was richer for remembering that some battles are won, not through conquest, but through the courage to choose love over fear, hope over despair, and light over the comfortable darkness of accepted sorrow.